came to the other side to the country of the Gadarenes, 2 demoniacs coming out of the tombs met him. They were so fierce that no one could pass that way. Suddenly they shouted, "What have you to do with us, Son of God? Have you come here to torment us before the time?" Now a large herd of swine was some distance from them. The demons begged him, "If you cast us out, send us into the herd of swine." And he said to them, "Go." So they came out and entered the swine. Suddenly the whole herd rushed down the steep bank into the sea and perished into the water. The swineherds ran off, and on going into the town, they told the whole story about what had happened to the demoniacs. Then the whole town came out to meet Jesus, and when they saw him, they begged him to leave their neighborhood.
Admittedly, we're not going to follow that story as close as we've followed a bunch of the stories, or as we've been staying in Matthew. There's some themes in that story that, frankly, I don't think Matthew will let us get away from, and so as we move into Matthew in the fall, we'll return to them. What I want to do this morning is try to attempt to summarize what we've all been through this year, and I recognize that we all refers to 8 billion people or however many there are on the planet, but more specifically, I want to try to speak to what it's been like to be a person of faith, what it's been like to be a person of attempted faith, what it's been like to be a part of this Narrate community or even the Helena community, because it sure seems like we've been through a lot. There's been countless conversations and lots of wrestling and at times tears and arguing and opportunity and joy. And it just to me feels like one of those moments that we shouldn't just kind of mindlessly move into the next season, but try to capture what did we just experience? And more than that, what's important about what we just experienced? How do we carry some lessons into the future? So this morning, what I'm going to do is kind of speak to some of the stuff that I feel and that we feel, and as a staff, I'm humbled by the chance to, in many ways, just summarize some of our conversations, myself and the staff, as well as myself and many of you, and many of the conversations that I've not been privy to. But more than that, what I want to do is try to represent for you, again, I think it's this moment, and I don't think it's going to last but for a few days, where we can try to capture before we just move into what is another season and realize that we never actually really did the work. So I'd like to pray, and we'll jump in. God, thanks that you lead us, and thanks for things like communion that remind us that things change, and yet at the same time, there's some constants, and that one of those, Jesus, is your commitment to us and your faithfulness to people despite, at times, our faithfulness to one another and to you. So pray that you'd prompt us in whatever ways that you care to, and give us permission to ignore whatever's not from you. We love you. Amen. All this week, it reminded me of when I was going to grad school. There was 4 of us that would always rent the same car and stay in the same house, and so we were inseparable for 10 days. Which means that if one of the guys in the group had like something he wanted to do on a night off, we all had to go do it. Well, in one of those cases, my friend Brian Hopkins, who is one of the single most talented people I ever know, you'll meet him in October. He's at a church in Sacramento now, and he actually offered to come over this summer, and anyway, it didn't work out, but he's going to be here in October. But he was very much the alpha male. He always drove, and in this case, he had the idea. And the idea was that there was a denomination of churches, pretty small group, lots of small churches, that was having their 50th anniversary celebration, kind of in the woods at some camp around Portland. And so he suggested that we should all go. And so myself and Brian and John and Brad, I think it was a Friday night, we all made our way to this camp. And I don't know if you've ever driven anywhere in Portland, but it's like you're lost as soon as you leave town because it's just forest. I don't even remember where we went. I remember we drove for about an hour. We arrived at kind of a church camp, but Oregon style. In fact, what I remember is we pulled up and we parked, and Brian, it was just this beautiful, beautiful chunk of property, a bunch of old growth trees, and Brian made the comment, he said, you know what we should do is we should sell this camp because we could plant a lot of churches with that money. It was even before we had planted Narrate, but we went in, and again, picture camp, if you've ever had an experience at camp, for all the better and the worse. It was this large building with pine paneling walls and a pine paneled ceiling. We walked into a banquet-style setting. Not much by way of technology, and by much I mean anything other than light bulbs. I mean, there was a very modest stage, no sound system, no projection, nothing like that. A bunch of round tables set up banquet-style, tablecloths down to the floor. And we sat down, and of course, first thing you do is you eat. And I successfully predicted what the meal would be. Because if you went to a church banquet of some sort in the 2000s, the meal was always Schwann's man chicken cordon bleu, right? Like that was the shtick in the 2000s. The chicken and the meat and whatever that white imitation cheese stuff is. I had mastered, because I'm a food snob, I guess. I had mastered how to cut up a chicken cordon bleu and spread it across your plate, eat none of it, but not offend the host, while at the same time drinking lots of waters to quiet the hunger pains. And then there's the cake that comes afterwards that has so much sugar that it preserves till the year 3000. So we didn't show up pretentious at all. Like, there was nothing about our attitude that was in any way looking down our nose at anybody. We ate the meal and did the thing, and then, of course, we were all kind of like, I wonder what the program's going to be. Because, again, it's a 50th anniversary. I'm 30-something, so everybody in the room is old, even though in hindsight, today I'm older than probably half the people in the room. And about the time you expected the program to start, this woman emerged, and she came from the back of the room, and I'm going to guess she was something in her 60s. She had a perm, just a round perm, and she was carrying a portable CD player. This was the technology for the event, which actually in 2008 wasn't so bad, a boombox. And she stepped up on this, again, very discreet, kind of small stage, and she set it on the front of the step, and she hit play, and it was just an audio track of a band. So no live drums, no live guitar, just this CD. And then she started to sing. And I didn't grow up in this kind of church context, so I didn't, because at some point I'm like, who is this? And one of my buddies is like, it's Sandy Patty. She's singing a Sandy Patty song, which some of you are like, oh yeah, she was a big guy. I had never heard of anybody know who Sandy Patty is? Yeah, see, all the old people, including me. I'm just kidding. So she's singing the Sandy Patty song, and again, just to be frank, like, I came from a megachurch culture. Vern is one of the best programmers I've ever met. Like, excellence is super high, and so I'm this 30-something in seminary sitting watching what I see old people, and it wasn't very good. And to try to describe her vocals, it's hard to do, but fortunately I don't have to describe them, because there was something that happened that says it all. Because as she started to sing, and I'm starting to bite my knuckle, I heard instinctively, subconsciously, I heard something rustling over here. And, it was a bunch of banquet tables, and there's one it was kind of a full room, and there's one over here. And as I instinctively looked over to hear the sound, simultaneously, this very large dog came out from underneath the other table. So this like large golden retriever type dog apparently had been stowed away successfully throughout the meal, but then the music started and he couldn't take it anymore. And I learned in that moment that I speak dog, because we made eye contact. Like, as he came out from underneath the table, we made eye contact, and he just said, like, get me out of here. It was this hilarious, horrible experience. And I remember now you feel like that kid in, like, high school who's trying not to laugh and make the teacher mad, so now we're all trying to not to look at the dog, because the dog he just did this thing for, like, the rest of the song. He was just, please help me. It was this most endearing look. So I pulled my phone out of my pocket, and I texted my friend Vern, who is, again, my friend that I worked for 10 years, and he knew we were there. He's also associated, and I texted him, and I said, if I could describe with perfect detail what was happening right now, you would call me a liar. It's just that unbelievable. Now, I know that sounds pretentious and unkind, but I tell that story intentionally because I think it's as much making fun of me as it is her. Because I wonder if part of the moment that we're in isn't this time to recognize that there's seasons have lifespan to them, or ideas have a lifespan to them, and that people like myself and Christ followers like us, we're more prone than most to miss the moment when the effectiveness of an idea passed. We tend to be more guilty than most cultures of recognizing, like, wait a minute, why are we doing that? And does that still make sense? And does it still work? And that's the way that I'm thinking about this season. Mark Sayers, this Australian author who I've really enjoyed some of his work, he's one of the guys behind the podcast, This Cultural Moment. I heard him ask this question in a book called Reappearing Church. And he asked this question, he says, what if this cultural moment is only a crisis if we ignore God's call for renewal? And I think whether you're a God follower or not, we can go to that next slide. Like, what if this cultural moment, what if it's only the end of the world, so to speak, And I guess I'm speaking to this both personally within your own life, within your own marriage, within your own connection to God and how you think about that, within your own connection to Narrate, and ours together. What if it's only a crisis if we just breeze through it and don't do the work of asking ourselves, so what still makes sense? And what served people really well back there and it doesn't anymore? And what brought connection back then and it doesn't anymore? I was listening to a guy on a podcast this week. His name is Bishop Barron. I actually put this podcast on the mind map because I thought it was one of the most insightful cultural commentaries that I've heard in a long time. In it, he referenced a guy named Richard Rohr. You may be familiar with Richard Rohr, but in fact, I thought it spoke to Barron's graciousness because, frankly, I don't think him and Rohr see eye to eye on everything, but his willingness to speak so well of him, I thought was a good example in its own right of what's maybe missing. But what he summarized was some of Rohr's, I think, better work around this idea of the initiation rituals of primal people. Now, that's kind of technical language. We could throw that up there. But the initiation rituals of primal people, what it speaks to, and you've probably heard, there's different people have spoken to this for years now, but that other cultures oftentimes were better than we are at saying to their kids, hey, in this moment of time, you're no longer a child, you're an adult. And in this moment of time, the primary purpose of your life before was us meeting your needs and your being safe, but that time has passed. And what he spoke to is these cultures will expose people to danger, sometimes to pain. There's these oftentimes very formal processes by which they say to kids, to young adults, we might say, hey, and it's really three things I think that come from these. One, it's not about your safety. Like life is hard. And that's part of being an adult. Two, you're going to die. And to manage your life around that idea is a waste of time. You're going to die. And therefore, three, life's not about you. I think for me, that's another maybe metaphor of the way that we can potentially think of this season of what if we've gone through our own kind of initiation ritual where the opportunity is both within your family, within yourself, within a community, to really go, okay, so what's the growing up that needs to happen from this last season? What's the shifting? In that same message, Bishop Barron made a statement that I'd like to put in a question, but I think it speaks to this whole idea. And the question is this: what if Christianity isn't for Christians? Like, what if your Christianity is not for you? What if it's for the world? And what if that's always been the way this God has went about kicking hell out of his creation through a people who fundamentally decide life isn't about them, it's about others and this God. Remember, Jesus starts his longest recorded sermon by saying, you're the light of the world. You're the salt of the earth. The implication is it's not about you. And even in that passage that Amy just read for us, we explored last week that faith oftentimes takes us beyond our comfort zone. I just wonder if it's worth pausing and asking the question, why did Jesus take them there? Why to this other side? Why to this uncomfortable space? Why to this darkness? And could it be that built within that is that reminder that Jesus' plan has always been to bring something to culture? And part of what's really hard about being a Christ follower is how do we find a healthy tension between saying things that resonate and saying things that frankly critique? Like, how do we avoid being the fundamentalist that none of us are seeking to be, but at the same time, how do we avoid just a permissiveness that, frankly, absent us, won't get done, a permissiveness that doesn't honor Christ? A guy named John Mark Comer, who's a thinker in the Portland area, and admittedly, his stuff didn't resonate with me before COVID, but he started doing some work in April of 21 that really started for me to find handles in terms of how do we lead this thing forward. And he preached a message in April in which he started with this question. He said, who did you lose in 2020? And he wasn't actually speaking about COVID and death, and I'm not trying to trivialize that, but he was speaking to what happened because of the thing that occurred. What happened because of the ideological polarization that happened? Probably everyone in this room lost somebody. And maybe you're hoping it's not permanent, but relationships have shifted. Relationships with friends, relationships with your own kids, relationships with your own parents, with coworkers. Who did you lose in this last season? And I think just as important is what did you lose? Like, what ideas don't resonate anymore? What values don't hold weight for you anymore? And what if there's some value in rather than forcing yourself to pretend that they do, of naming those things and doing the work of figuring out then, just because you feel that way doesn't mean it's right, but you can't really work through it until you acknowledge that. You know, I wonder for how many of you was the final chord between you and what we might call conservative Christianity severed? Like, maybe you were connected to it before COVID, maybe you weren't really or barely were, but I wonder how many people here are just completely alienated by the conservative Christian kind of culture. The unapologetic chaplaincy for a certain political platform, the way in which they speak to certain things as though there's not nuance. I wonder how many of you fall into that category. I would say for myself, and again, just to try to keep your wheels turning, I would say I showed up, and it took me a while. This was kind of the work that I had to do was, I think I'm realizing I was disillusioned with conservative Christianity before COVID hit. That for me, COVID didn't do anything that hadn't already happened. And there's several bits to it that I think I just don't connect with. Maybe primarily is the telling kind of black and white, at times unkind culture. When I look at Christ in the scriptures, I see him telling stories that don't immediately make sense. Stories that spark wonder and awe. Stories that cause to reflect on the mystery of it all. I see Jesus asking questions. If I'm being honest, I think both the left and the right are guilty of having no mystery, those extremes. It doesn't seem to connect with the way of Jesus to me. I think part of my disconnect was the way they treat the Bible. I can genuinely say I love the Bible. It's the primary way by which I connect to God along with people. I can with integrity say that I'm not a pastor. I don't read the Bible because I'm a pastor. I fell in love with studying the text, and that's why I do what I do. But conservative Christianity has certain positions on Scripture that, frankly, and maybe you can relate, I don't identify with. I don't think the Bible's trying to do history the way we often ask it to. I don't think it imposes on itself certain words that we impose on. I don't think people in the Bible even knew of natural science the way we do. And therefore, to ask the Bible to be doing natural science, to me, is disingenuous. And I think the other thing, and this is what's coming out and maybe being confirmed in this Matthew series, I've wrestled for a long time with why I don't connect with the idea of raising hands at the end of a service and declaring that you want to follow Jesus and go to heaven. And I'm not trying to trivialize that. I think God uses that. If I'm being honest, I think my connection to communion has been, it brings resolution in a way that I think more accurately represents the gospel. I don't think Jesus was here to populate heaven after death. I think Jesus was here to populate earth now with kingdom-bringing people who brought certain principles, and that the idea was that would extend into all eternity. I don't think the story is about a God who's separating people for heaven and earth. I think the story is about a God who's trying to get the hell out of his earth. And the plan has always been through a people that this life matters. But I wonder if for those of you who are just completely disillusioned with conservative Christianity, if it's important that you admit that. Conversely, I wonder how many of you are on the opposite side. Like, liberal thinking, progressive thinking, and especially progressive Christianity makes even less sense to you now than it did before. See, this is part of the tension of this age, isn't it? Is so many of us, we conservative thinking makes no sense. And for others, progressive thinking makes no sense. I had a friend recently say to me, Adam, it is so hard to be a moderate right now. I was reminded of a college professor. I couldn't understand the difference between socialism and communism. And this professor, he said, Adam, they're the same thing. The arc is bent. They're on extreme opposite sides of the spectrum, but they're the same thing. And I wonder if extreme left and extreme right isn't guilty of the same thing right now. How many of you just became completely disillusioned with hyper-progressive Christian thinking? I'd put myself in that camp. I think because I hadn't done the work of recognizing that neither side perfectly captures Jesus, I think, frankly, before COVID, if you'd have got me alone in a corner somewhere, I'd have been forced to admit that I identify more progressive in my Christianity. But to be honest, I'm not there anymore. I think what's changed for me is, first and foremost, I'm not convinced that progressive Christianity is committed to the idea of sin as Jesus is. I absolutely value therapy and the sciences, and I believe that there's chemicals involved in our brains, but I'm concerned that progressive Christianity is playing chaplaincy to progressive secular humanism in the same way that conservative Christianity is guilty of playing chaplaincy to Republican ideals. To me, when I read through Matthew, and especially when I sit with the narrative left to right, I see a God who doesn't just see sin as some kind of moral violation in my own personal life, but as this vile thing that has negatively impacted God's creation from the very beginning, that is most often unleashed by humans, but that is part of the problem that we can't just think our way out of. I think the cross as a historical event is essential to the Jesus worldview, because absent of that, there's no conquering of evil in the world. It seems to me that what happened in that moment, among other things, was the future came into the present. And God, who keeps his promises with people who don't, kept his promise to bring reconciliation to heaven and earth. I think that we've got to continue to recognize that sin is part of the equation. That doesn't mean I don't think we need therapy, but it's there. If I'm being honest, I don't think that progressive Christianity is committed to the historic orthodoxy that I've grown to love. I think that if left to itself, it trivializes the value of this and worship in the text. I have friends who would be people who don't believe in the resurrection, and that's fine. You've got my word that the point at which I don't, I'll resign. Not because that makes me a bad person, but because I think Paul's right that without a resurrection, like, what are we doing? We're definitely not doing historic orthodoxy. I wonder if certain practices, like church, are more important in this new cultural moment than they were before. But again, my bigger point here is to go, what did you lose? What values no longer hold weight for you? See, I think part of what happened to me is I came to realize that there's this third way of Jesus, and that way's hard. I've spent the last 12 years in Helena and 20 years of my career trying to tell myself and others that following Jesus is pretty easy. What if it's not? What if Jesus wasn't just screwing around when he talked about the pearl of great price and how hard it is to love God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength? And I don't think that means we have to become pretentious. But it makes sense then when I see people that I love, including myself, get pulled into the polls. It would make sense that we have a hard time finding the third way of Jesus because it's hard. It takes energy. It takes creativity. My friend Fred said to me months ago, we were processing all this, and I was still trying to put it all together and make sense of it. And my friend Fred said, Adam, so here's a guy who isn't a pastor. He meets with people. He's been doing it for 40 years. He says, unapologetically, the last year has been the hardest ministry of my life. I've never seen 20-somethings suffer as much as they're suffering right now. But he said, Adam, I think Christians on both sides of the political aisle are really guilty of confusing their friends because we've so put in a political ideology before a Christian identity that we've confused people. And I guess to whatever extent I have any vision for what does it look like to be a church in the 20s, it has something to do with not that we shouldn't be involved in politics, absolutely, and we should pray for our friends who are. Not that it's not okay to be a Republican or a Democrat, absolutely. I'm not suggesting some kind of Anabaptist way that just removes ourselves from culture, but what if the way of the 20s is a rugged commitment among a community of people to make their primary identity that of Christ in the way of Jesus, and not to become the voice of one or the other radicalized side. Countless times, literally, I've been asked over the last 6 months or so, Adam, is Narrate trying to become more conservative? Is that your agenda? And I've offered an answer in several different ways. I don't know if any of them are sufficient, but I think I have one now. And it would be something like this. It's not that we're trying to become more conservative. It is that I think that this cultural moment is a new chapter in the book. And therefore, we have to pay attention to what are the opportunities for renewal. How do we recognize, like, Sandy Patty was great in her day, but what this cultural moment is asking for us is different than it was there. I think that sometimes it does us well to think about there's certain things that'll get done if there's no Christ followers in the community. There's lots of things that'll get done if there's not Christ followers in the community. But what are the things that won't get done if there aren't any? And to me, what makes that important is the realization that there's certain things, like, say, pray, that nobody else is going to do if I don't do it, if you don't do it. What if this cultural moment asks us to take those roles and vocations more seriously? So how do we move forward? And I'm sorry for the kind of lecture, but I guess it just felt like time to go like, hey, to the extent to which you're wondering, here's the way myself and the staff, here's how we're making sense of this, the conversations I'm having, here's where we're going. I think first and foremost, we want to retain a high value on hospitality. In my view, Christian hospitality is more important now than it ever was. I'm less comfortable with the word safe because I don't think we can agree on what safety is any longer, but hospitality, creating space where people, no matter what they believe or think, know that they're welcome. Doing things that convey value to people, something as simple as a good cup of coffee or a mint in a bathroom, something like an ales fest that causes people to go, I'm confused. This is a church. I think Christian hospitality is more important than ever, don't you? I think we want to retain a high value on serving people. We called ourselves Narrate in the beginning because we recognized people don't need more words. They need to hear a story about a cruciform God who serves. And so nothing changes there in my view. But what does change? Well, frankly, I think we got to place a higher value on our Sunday gatherings and the role that they help in helping people lean into their relationship with Christ. I'll try not to beat this drum too much because it's not lost on me that it's convenient for my own ego. But I do think one of the questions we've all got to sit with is what if regular Sunday attendance in a community of faith is more important in the 20s than it was in the 10s? Like, what if in a no longer majority Christian world, we need more intentional space that reinforces to us the way of Jesus and helps us step into another week? What I've learned in the last 18 months is before this, the game was talk about God and make him relevant enough, but don't weird people out. And again, I'm not repenting of that. I'm not suggesting that was wrong. I don't think that's the cultural moment anymore. When I sit with people who have been here in this season, who are watching, there's this desire for something that equips them into this different way of living. There's this desire for something that invites us to lean into and further form our identity in Christ. Part of the reason for the 1045 is I think maybe we need to add one more song more often than not. Communion staying a regular piece of the worship experience. We just need a couple more minutes. I think the other thing that we have to work on is, go ahead to that next one, is placing a higher value on people living out their faith in community. Not for a second do I want to abandon that this is a safe place to hide. I just had a conversation this week again with a couple who showed up burnt out from where they came from, and initially they didn't believe us that they didn't have to volunteer right away, but they're starting to get the message that, oh, so it's okay if we sit in the back row for a year or two. And the answer is yes. But what I learned in COVID was a radical exposure of my own worldview, which was that all you need is you and Jesus, and I think it's an abomination of the gospel. The people I watched thrive in this season were people who want to live their faith in community. It's funny, I really only know two different types of people right now. I know people who emerged more lonely than they were before, and people who emerged exponentially more connected. And so as a staff, our commitment through things like Matthew groups and also just networking is the extent to which someone wants to find community, we need to better help them do that. The other thing is students. You've heard me say that part of the reason why we hired Avery was to bring energy to that. I'm so proud of what the Durgas and the Bilyus and Jelena are doing for students, but we've got to scale it. I think those of us who are in our 30s and 40s have no idea how much more difficult it is to follow the alternative of Jesus than it is, how much more difficult it is today than it was in our own moment. And so we're going to create all kinds of invitations. In fact, we're even working on kind of a middle school gathering here in the next month. We just found a couple this week who's like, hey, we want to pour into students. There's opportunities, and we want to really invest. We even had this great new event that we were going to do. I thought it would be great, and we just as a staff decided we're not going to do it because we've got to keep the priority of students in front of ourselves this year. And the last one, And this, I think this is as much a commitment to myself and to you as it is anything, is I connect with those who are saying that to follow Jesus in the 20s is going to require a new commitment to the spiritual practices. Those things that for a couple thousand years the church has leaned into, not as a form of legalism, but things like morning devotion time, things like intentional prayer, things like Sundays, things like fasting, I think maybe have more importance in this next season than they did in the last. I guess I want to end with this and just get you thinking about it this way. Most of us, I think, whether we have kids or not, our calendars function September through August. It's not January through December, even though that's the way we've constructed our calendar. For most of us, we're a few days from September 1st. And that's kind of the start of a new year. And here would be my concern if I have any awareness of it at all. My concern would be that 2020 was hard. We suffered. There was so many things that happened. Nobody needs me to reiterate them. And then 21 hit, and there was a vaccine that gained a head of steam, and then spring hit. And suddenly what we found ourselves doing was camping and playing and traveling and doing things that we hadn't done for a long time, but maybe hadn't done the work of the grief of this last season. And my concern is that if we're not careful, we step into September and a new school year and a new year cycle, and before we know it, we'll be stressing out because the in-laws are coming over for Thanksgiving, and then next thing you know, it's Christmas, and pretty soon it's the middle of January and we're complaining about the snow. And only then do we begin to maybe realize, wait a minute, I'm 2 years into this thing that I've not actually located, not actually done the work. So here would be my challenge, and I'm not going to beat this drum again next week, I promise. But would you be willing sometime today, tomorrow, maybe even next Sunday, because ironically we won't have gatherings, but would you be willing to just create some space, go for a walk, go for a drive, go have dinner with your spouse, and just have a conversation around what changed? What values don't I value anymore? What new behaviors are going to become a priority? Because I think really the question is this, what story you're trying to live within? I think I've decided I'm no longer going to try to talk ideology with people, conservative, progressive. I think it's not helpful. I wonder if the helpful question is, what's the story you believe in? What's the story your life is about? And therefore, what are the priorities of that story? And could it be, as the band comes up here, we're going to lead in the band, could it be that just creating space to be honest with yourself, even if you're maybe not proud of some of the conclusions, is really a really important step in the grief of this moment? So in just a minute, we're going to give you a chance as the band leads us in a song. There'll be elements over here, and if you haven't taken communion with us, we'd like to think it's fairly intuitive, though I would say when you get over to here, if you think about the arc and go 2 by 2 to the wine pourers, that's really helpful. So if it clears, if you're the first person, go to the second person. It gets tight over here, but anyway, they'll give you bread and wine, but maybe just use this moment to just create some space of, okay, Lord, is there anything you want to talk about? And maybe even think about when you could deepen this conversation tonight, tomorrow, sometime this week, maybe next Sunday. Thanks.
If you would like to learn more about Narrate Church, find us at narratechurch.org or look us up on Facebook and Instagram.